Cuba. It's an amazing country. It is called the Island of Freedom. One could say freedom from stereotypes. The country that once amazed Christopher Columbus, for the possession of which there was a persistent struggle between the leading European powers, is now striking with total devastation and poverty. Once all the gold and silver flowed here, and the territory of Cuba was a kind of transshipment point before sending the loot to Spain. The country was awash in riches, but almost the entire local population was brutally destroyed. Cuba opened its doors to American gangsters who lived large and drove around in colorful limousines, while the slave trade and prostitution flourished behind the luxurious facades. It is a country that succeeded in gaining the right to independence. But ironically, it has fallen into a real darkness and decay, and for more than half a century, it has been trying to rise from its socialist knees. Cuba's architecture is a mixture of Baroque and dilapidated buildings that are still living. Here you will not find the usual sodas and fast food, but at the same time, life expectancy is much higher than in more developed countries. Here, absolutely all citizens receive free medical service, but only necessary medicines are often absent, and imported drugs are not available at all. Cuba has the lowest crime rate among other Latin American countries, and theoretically, the island could become a magnet for the travelers. There is everything for it: endless snow-white beaches, azure Caribbean coast, radiant sun, and temperamental local population, creating a vibe of leisurely fun. But why tourists do not rush to visit Cuba, and those who have been here admit that they would hardly want to return here again? Cuba gives the impression of a country that has survived a natural disaster. It seems that many years ago the inhabitants left it, but recently for some reason they returned. They settled in shabby mansions in Spanish colonial style, fixed the holes in the walls with improvised materials, boarded up the windows with plywood to keep out the sun, and began to lead a quiet, simple life. Cuba has lived in isolation for more than half a century. International sanctions have blocked the flow of food, clothing, electronics, and cars to the island. The majority of the population lives in deep poverty, and many live in poverty at all. The average salary here is $25 a month. The population survives on a food set, which is issued on cards, but to buy anything, you have to stand in a kilometer-long line. Dairy products are difficult to get. Beef is almost impossible. Eggs will have to search long and hard. Stores greet visitors with empty shelves, and products are thrown away. As in the Soviet Union, no more than two in one hand. People go out for food every day, like hunting. There are no world brands that we are used to. There is almost no construction. The internet is not available everywhere, and it is terribly expensive. The automobile industry is stuck in the 60s of the last century. You can easily find Soviet cars here. The queues to the bank line up in long snakes from the street, and getting a visa is extremely problematic. There is constant police surveillance on the streets. Checks are organized at any place and at any time. A truly anti-people regime reigns in the country. Is it such an island of freedom, as Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara assured? The history of Cuba begins in 1492. That's when Christopher Columbus discovered the island. It was inhabited by Indian tribes, and the total population at that time was about 200,000 people. The conquest of Cuba by the Spanish, begun in 1510, lasted about 2 decades and was accompanied by almost complete extermination of the local population. Thus, by the middle of the 16th century, only about 5,000 Indians remained on the island. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Spanish actively exported gold from Cuba, and with the depletion of its reserves in the late 70s, in Cuba appeared cattle farms, and later plantations of sugarcane and tobacco, where slaves from Africa were imported to work. The Spanish crown sought to prevent direct trade between Cuba and other countries. Goods were imported into Cuba only through the Spanish ports of Seville and Cadiz, and were heavily taxed, leading to a significant proliferation of illegal trade. The coastal areas of Cuba were a haven for pirates and smugglers. As a result of the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, Havana, the capital of Cuba, was captured by the British, who established a free trade regime in Cuba. After the British left, the Spanish crown was forced to expand the rights of Cuban planters, trade with European countries, especially France, and then the United States, caused total sugar and tobacco production. By the end of the 18th century, Cuba had become a major supplier of sugar to the world market. By the end of the 19th century, Havana became the center of the liberation movement against the power of the Spanish colonizers. And in February 1895, a revolution broke out in the city, followed by a People's Liberation War that engulfed the entire country. In September 1895, Havana proclaimed Cuba's independence from the Spanish government. But in the conflict between Spain and Cuban Republicans intervened the United States, which declared war on Spain. And in 1898, at the height of hostilities between Spain and the United States, American troops invaded Havana, occupying the city and blocking the coastal areas of the island. The military occupation of Cuba increased its economic dependence on American capital. U.S. direct investment increased by $30 billion during this period. The Cuban-American Sugar Company and a national bank were established. In fact, Cuba became a colony of the United States. In 1902, the U.S. imposed on Cuba a treaty of mutual favorability, and in 1903, on granting a plot of land in the area of Guantanamo Bay for the placement of a military base. An interesting fact is that the Cuban side unilaterally withdrew from the treaty and does not recognize its legitimacy. But the U.S. does not agree with this. For them, Guantanamo is of political interest. The Americans have built a prison there, to which they send without trial those who are considered terrorists. In the early 30s of the last century, Cuba became a kind of Latin American Las Vegas. Americans liked to come to Havana on weekends and spend time in pleasant surroundings. They lived in separate neighborhoods where the future had already arrived. Beautiful houses with electricity, various appliances, expensive furniture, good food, and their own security. The colorful, bright convertibles whizzing along the streets, faded billboards along the road, preserved as a rarity, signs of fashionable stores still remind of those times. Havana was a thriving, progressive city, but the rest of Cuba was not so happy. As any coin has two sides, Cuba had an unpleasant flip side. There was a common expression that Cuba was a sugar bowl and a brothel for the U.S. The sugar bowl because Cuba exported almost all of its sugar to the U.S., and the brothel because of mass prostitution, including child prostitution. The slave trade flourished on the island. Bandits kidnapped girls and young women and forced them to trade their bodies. There were more than 8,000 brothels in Havana alone, and the work was so hard and with such unbearable conditions that on average prostitutes lived no more than 7 years after leaving the so-called service. The entire tourist and entertainment business in the country was controlled by American gangsters, and the United States was quite satisfied with this state of affairs. The population of the island was divided into a small caste of the elect and commoners, who were treated like cattle. The peasants lived in squalid huts, most of them without even the opportunity for education. The number of illiterates was as high as 50% of the population. The healthcare system was in its infancy, and mass epidemics literally mowed people down by the hundreds. At the same time, business owners, plantation owners, bankers, major officials, and military officers literally bathed in luxury. The Cuban economy, including the entire financial sector, was almost entirely subordinated to the United States. Foreign capital was actively attracted to the country, which only increased the island's dependence on the United States. 46% of the cultivated land in the country belonged to large landowners, latifundists. Workers and peasants were completely dependent on the goodwill of the capitalists. The economy was also controlled through customs tariffs reduced for American goods. The Fulgencio Batista regime, which had seized power in Cuba since 1933, absolutely suited the Americans. The Cuban dictator established personal ties with the American mafia, and many gangsters were received on an official level in the best hotel in Havana, the National de Cuba. Political opponents of the regime, on the other hand, usually went missing. But in 1953, almost immediately after Stalin's death, the longest Cuban revolution in history began. There followed 6 long years of armed confrontation, unsuccessful assaults, and demonstrative executions of rebels, and only in 1959 the Batista regime fell. The people welcomed Fidel Castro Che Guevara, who proclaimed revolutionary ideals: land to peasants, factories to workers, death to the enemies of the revolution. One of the first actions of the new government was agrarian reform, which nationalized foreign-owned land. As a result of the reform, over 100,000 peasants received land plots. The Mineral Control Act was passed, which imposed a 25% tax on metals and minerals exported by American companies. New customs tariffs were approved, imposing a levy of 100% of the value on imports of luxury goods such as cars, jewelry, yachts, and other American goods. The reforms of the new Cuban government provoked a sharp reaction from the management of foreign companies and the U.S. government. In order to put pressure on the Cuban government, the state stopped oil imports to Cuba and also passed legislation to reduce imports of Cuban sugar to the U.S. In response, the Cuban government began nationalizing U.S. companies. A law was passed to forcibly expropriate foreign property, the value of which was paid to the former owners with bonds that were repaid over 30 years. 3 oil refineries and 36 U.S. sugar refineries, with a total value of $650 million, were nationalized. By mid-1961, Cuba had established a state sector of the economy that had a monopoly on foreign trade. It controlled the banking system, included 90% of industry, and 41% of agricultural land. Fidel Castro announced the country's transition to a socialist path of development, and the USSR became an important ally of Cuba, providing great assistance in the establishment of Cuban socialism. The Soviet Union provided Cuba with a $100 million loan, assisted in the construction and reconstruction of Cuban industrial enterprises, as well as in the supply of petroleum products and industrial goods, the purchase of Cuban consumer goods, and agricultural products. Trade turnover between the USSR and Cuba increased from $170 million in 1960 to $5.3 billion by 1981 and to $8.4 billion by 1987. Everything was going well at first, but the Cuban crisis occurred, which became a turning point in Cuba's history. The beginning of the 60s, the world is on the verge of nuclear war. The tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is growing to critical limits. In 1961, America deploys missiles with nuclear warheads on the territory of Turkey, which can easily reach Moscow. The Soviet Union looks for an opportunity to respond and chooses Cuba, where it installs its missiles right on the border with the United States. October 1962. The clock is ticking down. Cuban President Fidel Castro believes that we must strike first or it will be too late. He demands a strike against the U.S. to prevent the Americans from invading Cuba. In a telegram to Khrushchev, Fidel writes that the Cuban people are ready to sacrifice themselves in the fight against imperialism. Tension reaches a climax, but suddenly Kennedy and Khrushchev reach an agreement. Common sense prevails and disaster is avoided. The Soviet Union removes missiles from Cuba, and the states remove their warheads from Turkey. At the request of the USSR, the U.S. lifts the embargo on Cuba for 2 years, but afterward imposes such harsh sanctions that the economic system barely survives. In 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order for a complete trade embargo. Cuba found itself completely cut off from all trade routes. The American stranglehold should have completely cut off the oxygen of the Cuban economy, but good relations with the Soviet Union allowed the Cubans to withstand this blow. The USSR provided Cuba with about $3 billion in aid annually, bought overpriced rum, cane sugar, and tobacco, and supplied basic necessities. In 1966, U.S. citizens were forbidden to visit Cuba except with special permits. Soon, liability was imposed for cooperation with any Cuban organizations and companies. In the early 80s, the country was declared a sponsor of terrorism, but that was not all. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the change in its political and economic course threw the Cuban economy into the abyss of a severe crisis. There was an almost complete cessation of purchases of Cuban sugar, which meant a sharp decline in Cuba's export earnings. The switch to a freely convertible currency severely restricted the purchase of petroleum products, machinery, equipment, consumer goods, and food. The end of the era of global socialism could not but have an impact on the Cuban economy. In just a few years, from 1989 to 1993, the country's GDP shrank by almost 40%. Foreign technicians who had supported its industry began to leave the republic. Markets for its already few exports were lost. Even agriculture suffered. 70% of the livestock was put under the knife after the supply of Soviet mixed fodder was cut off. Enterprises were left without fuel, construction sites without metal structures and cement, and cars without spare parts. The cessation of supplies of oil and oil products, fertilizers, spare parts for agricultural machinery led to a sharp decline in production. The United States then decided to finally tighten the sanctions noose. In 1992, the U.S. Congress imposed a ban on remittances to Cuba to limit access to currency. The fact is that many Cubans who fled the country at different times helped their relatives from abroad, sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to Cuba every month, which allowed the country to accumulate foreign currency reserves. The White House also threatened to cut off funding to international institutions that would provide loans or other assistance to Cuba. That same year, U.S. law prohibited any maritime vessels doing business with Cuba from entering U.S. ports for 180 days. This almost nullified the importation of food and medicine into the country. This was the worst period in the troubled history of the Cuban people. A much-aged Fidel Castro was adamant. Until the end of his life, the commander refused to recognize the obvious. It is impossible to stand alone against the American empire. The Cuban government relied on tourism, trade liberalization, and the opening of free economic zones. Modern hotels sprang up, import channels were expanded, and customs controls were relaxed. From 1991 to 1993, $400 million of the $500 million in total foreign investment was invested in the tourism industry. Cuba joined the WTO, and the U.S. was powerless here. This gave the right to do business with foreign companies. However, even here, the U.S. did everything possible to hinder Cuba. The White House forbade American citizens to visit Cuba more often than once every 3 years and to spend more than $50 a day there. In order to officially travel to the island, United States residents required a special permit. Bypassing the rules was punishable by prison. Nevertheless, the Cubans found a solution. They simply stopped giving Americans a stamp on the border crossing. A dramatic change came in the noughties. Severely ill, Fidel Castro first tacitly and then officially transferred power to his younger brother, Raul. In 2011, he became the head of the Communist Party of Cuba. More moderate in his views than his older brother, Raul began a mild liberalization of the economy and society. Citizens were allowed to buy cell phones, use the internet, and rent cars. Soon, small and medium-sized businesses were legalized. The bureaucracy was reduced. Farmers were allowed to plant their own crops, and city dwellers were allowed to privatize their apartments. Raul Castro saw the new reforms as the salvation of the socialist system. At the same time, sanctions against Havana were waived by almost all countries previously involved. European politicians began to urge the U.S. to lift the embargo and come to the Republic's aid. They were joined by Russia, China, and international human rights organizations. In particular, in 2014, Russia forgave Cuba $31.7 billion of debt to the USSR. The Republic was simply unable to pay it. On December 17, 2014, U.S. President Barack Obama and Raul Castro, President of the Council of State of Cuba, announced the resumption of diplomatic relations. And already in July 2015, in Washington and Havana embassies of both countries started working. Cuba was removed from the list of countries that support terrorism. However, the trade embargo is still in effect. The trade ban has been extended by both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The U.S. economic sanctions against Cuba are the longest in world history. One of the last socialist countries on earth has been almost completely isolated for the past 62 years. However, the Cuban authorities, despite the objective difficulties in the economy, do not give up the conquest of the revolution and are in no hurry to change the people's course to please the imperialists. The island of liberty has learned to survive in total isolation. The United States has never been able to change the Cuban regime that it does not like. As for the ordinary inhabitants, it was as if they did not notice the hardships their country had endured and the iron curtain that hid the charm of the American good life. Of course, many people have left the island, and young people are not in a hurry to connect their lives with Liberty Island. However, the people on the streets, despite all the hardships, do not look so unhappy. Everyone sings, dances, laughs. Cubans know how to enjoy what they have and find joy in simple things. They manage to love life, smoke cigars, listen to incendiary music, and enjoy the luxurious views of the Caribbean Sea. And perhaps that's something worth learning from them.